Hi, and thanks for watching this message video, and don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget that there's a podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video and life lesson. Today, we're continuing on in our series called The Path, where we're looking at all of the different things that it takes to be followers of Jesus. And the way that we're explaining it is that it's like following Jesus along the right path. And all of these different things that we do as followers helps us to stay on the right path. Last week, we talked about how faith and fear is how we get onto the path and it keeps us moving along the path. This week, we're going to talk about the first O in the acrostic of followers, which stands for obedience. Now, believe it or not, a biblical principle formed throughout the Old Testament is that obedience to God begins with a genuine fear of Him. For example, most people know that Moses is the guy that God used to lead Israel out of Egypt to the Mount Sinai, where he introduced himself to Israel. But before all of that took place, if you know anything about the history of Israel and Egypt, there were some bad things going on in Egypt, and we're told that some Hebrew midwives did a very incredible thing, and we're actually told why they did that incredible thing. Here's what we're told. Exodus 1:15 through 22. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," the midwives replied. "They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time." So God was good to the midwives. And the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. "Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live." In this story, we're told that it was a fear of God that prompted these women to be obedient to God and remain on the right path, even though they clearly feared Pharaoh and knew that disobeying his commands could mean death. And God blessed them for being obedient to him and disobeying the king. Now, some say the fear we should have of God is more respect or reverence than being terrified of him, but that's debatable. For example, as mentioned earlier, Moses was the one that led the Israelites out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, where God met them. But when they met him, they were so terrified or afraid of him that they said to Moses, "Hey, man, we don't want anything to do with God. You speak to him on our behalf," which led God to say this to Moses. Deuteronomy 5:28 through 29. "The Lord heard the request you made to me, and he said, 'I have heard what the people said to you, and they are right. Oh, that they would always have hearts like this, that they might fear me and obey all my commands. If they did, they and their descendants would prosper forever.'" That's a lot to think about. When we do stop and think about it, though, it's very clear that God himself said, if the Israelites had remained fearfully terrified of God, they would have obediently walked the right path and their prosperity would have been legendary. And almost to emphasize this principle even more throughout the Old Testament, enter King Solomon, the son of David. For those who don't know that story, in the beginning, Solomon had a terrific heart for God. And so when God asked him, "Go ahead and request anything you want from me," Solomon asked for wisdom, which according to the Bible is the equivalent of asking for a fear of God. Well, because of this request, Solomon was obedient and became blessed in a legendary way, but he unfortunately lost this mindset, this willingness or this fear of God, and as a result, he started walking the wrong path, and ultimately he was known for being that very guy who walked both the right path and walked the wrong path. So when he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes to somewhat sum up his whole life story, Here's how he concluded it. Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. That's the whole story. Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commands, for this is everyone's duty. God will judge us for everything we do, including every secret thing, whether good or bad. Fearing God is essential to being obedient to his commands. We see that with the story of the Hebrew midwives. We see that with the story of Moses and the Israelites. And we see that with the story of Solomon. Fearing God is essential to helping us to stay on the right path by being obedient to God and his commands. And again, according to Solomon, this is our duty. So, one of the things followers need to do to obediently stay on the right path is make sure we have a proper fear of God. And thanks to Jesus, we have a really good idea of what that fear of God is supposed to include. For instance, similar to the Hebrew midwives with the idea that their disobedience to a king / obedience to God could get them harmed or killed, that's what Jesus was saying to his disciples as well. But look at who it is that he told his disciples to fear and why. Luke 12, 4 through 9. Dear friends, don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot do any more to you after that. But I'll tell you whom to fear. Fear God, who has the power to kill you and then throw you into hell. Yes, he's the one to fear. What is the price of 5 sparrows? 2 copper coins? Yet God does not forget a single one of them. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. I tell you the truth. Everyone who acknowledges me publicly here on earth, the Son of Man will also acknowledge in the presence of God's angels. But anyone who denies me here on earth will be denied before God's angels. Clearly, Jesus wanted his disciples to know that hell is real and that God has the power to throw anybody into hell. So therefore, rather than being obedient to any power on earth like a king, they are to remain obedient to God and stay on the right path like those Hebrew midwives did. And the reason is because they fear God. And again, Jesus included a fear of hell in that fear of God. Therefore, if Jesus taught his own disciples that a fear of hell should serve as a motivational tool for obedience to God, we should probably fear hell too and teach others to do the same. In fact, the truth is, all of those statements that Jesus made to those disciples then apply to us. So therefore, you and I need to look at all of these things and remember that our obedience to God should be based on a proper fear of God. And therefore, we need to have that same type of fear of God or hell, like what he asked his disciples to have. But it also applies to us in that he said to his disciples, hey, listen, God has every hair on your head counted, which means you're very valuable to him, which means he's investing into you, and he does not want to throw you or anybody else into hell. And so therefore, the idea is that you and I should be the kind of people who are staying on the right path, not necessarily being afraid of being thrown into hell. And the reason why is because we're being developed. We're being sanctified. We're being made holy because of Christ's Spirit within us. And when his Spirit within us, as was alluded to in the previous passage, that means that you and I are supposed to be openly declaring with our lives or our words that we are indeed followers of Jesus Christ. That's a part of being obedient to him. In fact, look at what it is that Paul said to the churches in Rome about this. Romans 10, 9 and 10. If you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God, and it is by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. In our modern day, as followers of Jesus, there are going to be times where we're going to have to overcome fears similar to the fears that the Hebrew midwives in Egypt needed to overcome. or the fears that Moses needed to overcome when leading the Israelites out of Egypt, or similar to the fears that the first disciples needed to overcome when they were facing persecution from Rome. And you and I are asked to do that same thing because of our fear of God, including a fear of hell, regardless of the outcome. So once again, for you and I to remain obedient to God and to stay on the right path, one of the things that we need to have is a proper fear of God. And yes, that does include a deep reverence and respect for God, but it also includes a deep fear or trembling of God. And that's what we're going to be talking about more on Sunday. I hope you can join us.